At long last, Shenmue has finally been re-released. Thanks to the efforts of D3T and Sega, these AM2 classics are now available on PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the PC. For Sega fans, this is truly a great day. And for those that have been watching Digital Foundry for a while, you might also recall that Shenmue is the catalyst which sparked the creation of DF Retro. Needless to say, Shenmue is a series which holds a special place in my gaming heart. There's simply no way I could not take a look at this new HD conversion then. So today we're going to explore the changes and improvements implemented in this new version of Shenmue, while stacking it up against the original Dreamcast version. Is this the definitive version of Shenmue that we've been waiting for? And is it even still worth playing today? Let's find out. 3 years ago, legendary game creator Yu Suzuki walked on stage at Sony's E3 2015 press conference to announce his intention to create the third chapter in the Shenmue series. The reaction of the crowd and speed in which the game was funded on Kickstarter serve as proof positive that fans are eager for more Shenmue. Yet since this announcement, many fans were left wondering whether Sega might finally re-release the original games. After all, they'd already released titles such as Jet Set Radio on modern consoles, so why not Shenmue? Well, at last the time has come and Shenmue has a new home. Developed by D3T in the UK, this brand new conversion of Shenmue appears to be a basic port on the surface, one focused on retaining the original look and feel of the games, but there's more to it than you might first think. While a proper remaster or remake would certainly have been wonderful, Shenmue 1 and 2 HD are still worth your attention. So let's begin with the first game. It should come as no surprise that Shenmue HD delivers a higher resolution experience. That's the whole point, right? Across all Xbox and PlayStation consoles then, Shenmue HD operates at 1080p. That's right, the PS4 Pro and Xbox One X do not seem to receive any enhancements here. Despite this, image quality is terrific. Shenmue uses a form of anti-aliasing that manages to clean up edges to the point where it's nearly impossible to see individual pixel steps in most scenes. It's an extremely effective solution, and one that holds up even on a 4K TV. More importantly, in comparison to Dreamcast, shimmering is kept to an absolute minimum, with thin objects and fine details appearing temporarily stable in the HD version. In its original format, Shenmue exhibits a lot of noticeable shimmering and aliasing, something that's rather atypical for the Dreamcast, honestly. And that's because Shenmue is one of the few games in the systems to completely eschew bitmaps, something it shares with AM2's arcade games. My guess is that AM2 felt the side effects of utilizing bilinear filtering in combination with bitmaps, which leads to blurred textures at oblique angles, took too great a toll on the perception of fine detail. The thing is, aside from improving performance, bitmaps also effectively act as texture anti-aliasing, so rolling without them produces the sort of shimmering you see in Shenmue. It's a curious choice. Thankfully, the HD version handles this much more effectively, enabling clean surfaces devoid of shimmering and artifacts. Beyond that, the HD version also avoids the dithering artifacts inherent in the Dreamcast version. Internally, many Dreamcast games utilize a higher color depth, but render out to a 16-bit front buffer to save on memory. This results in dithering when played using VGA. The HD version, however, utilizes a higher color depth across the board, solving this problem entirely. Beyond resolution, players now have the option of viewing the game in full 16:9 widescreen or in its original 4:3 aspect ratio, while also toggling low resolution rendering if you wanted to experience the sensation of 480p. There is one caveat to this, however. The cinematic cutscenes are displayed at 4:3 regardless of your selected settings. I'd imagine the selected camera angles used in these cutscenes simply introduced issues when displayed at a wider aspect ratio, and the decision was made to stick with the original presentation instead in order to avoid such glitches. Thankfully, the rest of the experience is fully widescreen enabled, and this includes normal dialogue sequences, exploration, and QTEs, among other things. Looking further, keep in mind that this is the first time the original Shenmue has existed on a machine other than Dreamcast. Importing the game to new platforms, the original assets were retained, likely out of necessity. That means that all the original models, textures, and audio exist exactly as they did on Dreamcast, But while the assets themselves might be the same, their usage is improved in certain areas. Take the sky, for instance. On Dreamcast, the sky texture is point sampled and pixelated, which is an odd choice considering that clouds, by their nature, appear soft. In comparison, the HD version solves this entirely by filtering the clouds. This scene also highlights another option available to the players, bloom. Okay, so bloom lighting is kind of a dirty word these days due to its overuse in the past, but in the case of Shenmue, it works surprisingly well. It subtly boosts the image vibrance and the luminosity of certain elements in a scene. The illuminated signs around town in the evening. The glow of the sun peering through the family dojo. All the way to the sky itself. With this feature enabled, they all exhibit a nice glow that contributes to the presentation. Since it is optional, however, it can be disabled if you prefer the original aesthetic. Of course, regardless of which setting you opt for, there is still a noticeable difference in general color and tone compared to the Dreamcast original. The HD version has a slightly warmer appearance in general, I find. This is especially true during the flashback sequences. The strong sepia tone of the Dreamcast version is replaced with a slightly different look in the new HD release. So what else has changed? Well, loading times are certainly much faster in the HD version, and this is perhaps one of the most significant changes. Moving between shops and different areas is now almost seamless, thanks to the speed increase. The frame rate is of course faster as well. While the Dreamcast game is reasonably steady in most scenes, busier streets such as this tend to exhibit frame rate drops. Clearly this game is pushing the system pretty hard. As you'd expect then, the HD re-release of Shenmue does not exhibit these same problems, at least based on my experience running back and forth across town. It's just a shame they couldn't clean up the pop-in issues, which are extremely evident still. Of course, no matter where you play, the game is still just 30 frames per second. This is a point of contention that often appears when discussing ports from older systems like this. In this case, the issue is once again likely tied to the way the game was designed. It may simply not be possible to run at higher frame rates without breaking something within the game. Of course, maybe it'll be modded later on. You see, there's the PC version as well. And that version also runs at 30 frames per second just like the console release in its default state. In fact, the PC version shares a lot with the console versions overall, but with a few additional options tucked away inside the options menu. This version, for instance, supports higher native resolutions, super sampling, along with resolution scaling, optional FXAA, and more. In its current state, it even supports ultra-wide monitors, well, kind of. The 3D portion of the game displays just fine, and the wider field of view further opens up the presentation. It looks great. Unfortunately, in the version I was testing for this video, the interface and letterboxing aspects aren't working quite right, but I've been told that these will be corrected by launch, so hopefully it won't be a problem. But basically, the menu appears kind of half cut off on the screen here, and during cutscenes, well, I got this. I also ran into an issue with the way it handles video output. When running full screen mode, Shenmue insists on using the highest refresh rate supported by your monitor. In my case, that's 75 Hz. But since the game is capped at 30 frames per second, you end up with noticeable judder due to the mismatch. Of course, borderless window mode is fine and runs at 60 Hz, but then you run into frame pacing issues. Again though, Sega was very clear that there are still a number of improvements coming for launch, so we'll have to wait and see how it turns out there. The last thing I want to touch on in the original game then is the audio. The original Dreamcast version doesn't sound great when playing digital audio samples like voice and sound effects, and that is true here as well. You see, voices are heavily compressed, and playback is of poor quality across all versions of Shenmue.
For the last time, where is the mirror?
I've no intention of telling you.
Unfortunately, there's likely no way to have improved the situation in any significant fashion without redoing all of the voices. I did find it interesting, however, that the file size for the English voice files in Shenmue 1 appear to be exactly half the size of the Japanese voice pack. Maybe I'm just looking at the file structure wrong, but I thought that was interesting since I always felt that the English voice acting exhibited more noticeable compression issues.
事件の日、黒い服の男を見ませんでしたか？
黒い服？猫なら見たけど。
On the day of the incident, did you see some men in black suits?
In black suits? No, I didn't. But I did see a cat, though.
Speaking of voice acting, one nice improvement to this version of the game is the option to select either Japanese or English voice acting, a feature that was not previously available on the Dreamcast, likely due to disk space limitations. One last thing, if you remember, in the original Japanese release there were a lot of licensed products, such as these Coke machines. It was a small detail, but it added a little bit of extra realism to the game. These were replaced in the localized version of the game, and in the re-release, well, I hope you like Bellwood's Jet Cola because that's what you're getting. All in all then, while there are a few limitations and issues to be aware of, this is now the definitive way to enjoy Shenmue 1. This is a solid port. But what about Shenmue 2? Well, this is where things start to get a little more interesting. You see, Shenmue 2 was originally released on Dreamcast as well, but not long after its release, it was also ported to the original Xbox with enhanced visuals. I compared them both in an episode of DF Retro on Shenmue 2, but I was curious to see where this new version would fall. Well, for starters, all the same basic elements that I mentioned before still apply to the sequel. The HD version is 1080p native on consoles, runs at 30 frames per second, and offers the same basic settings menu. But I found that Shenmue 2 benefits significantly more from the higher resolution than the original game does. Areas in the sequel tend to be a lot larger, but they also feature a greater assortment of flat plains and building facades. As a result, on Dreamcast, image quality is rather poor, with noticeable shimmering visible across nearly every scene. By combining effective anti-aliasing with a higher rendering resolution, however, the HD release appears dramatically smoother in motion. Distant detail is now sharp and clean, visible from across the map, and shimmering is greatly reduced. It's a huge improvement across the board. That said, there is one issue I have here. Cutscenes are even more letterboxed than before. While framed in 16:9, large black borders are drawn around the image, which on a large 16:9 television is a tad distracting. But of course, the real revelation here stems from its source. Shenmue 2 appears to be more of an Xbox port rather than a port from Dreamcast, but really it's kind of a combination of both, at least in terms of how it's presented to the user. That's right, all the benefits of the Xbox version are present and accounted for here. This includes things like water rendering. On the Dreamcast, you have this static plane mesh which undulates to simulate wave patterns. The HD and original Xbox versions, however, feature an improved animated water texture. Or how about shadows? Again, the Xbox and HD versions appear to use some sort of very basic stencil shadows to represent building shadows, while in comparison the Dreamcast version seems to use baked shading. The lens flare effect used for the sun is also improved, among many other little things like this. They even kept the various full-screen filters that were included in the Xbox version, an unexpected bonus. But of course, the one issue I've always had with the Xbox version is this blur used during combat. And thankfully, this is one feature that did not make the jump to the HD release. Combat sequences appear more in line with the Dreamcast version as a result, which basically means that this is now the best of both worlds, the benefits of Xbox, but without the drawbacks. It's great stuff. Another important element that applies to both games is the interface and font selection. D3T has taken the time to recreate all the various menus using high-resolution assets and fonts. It looks excellent now and contributes greatly to the enhanced presentation. It's a significant improvement over what was used in the Dreamcast version. There's also the arcade games, which made the transition to this new version of the game as well. You can sit down and play a number of classic Sega arcade titles, such as Hang On or Space Harrier, and it looks great. Pixels are razor sharp, and the games look and sound excellent. As with the original Shenmue, the loading times in the sequel are also greatly improved. More so even. Shenmue 2 features a much larger world than the original, with loads of different doors to enter. Faster loading times make exploration far less tedious this time around. Performance is also improved once again. Busy areas in Shenmue 2 can exhibit some pretty significant slowdown on the original Dreamcast version, and again, like the original, when the frame rate does drop, the entire game speed drops as well, since it is tied to the frame rate. On the modern consoles, however, performance is no longer a problem, just as you would expect. It's still 30 frames per second, but it's stable. Really, overall, this is a fantastic conversion, and is most certainly the best way to enjoy Shenmue 2 today. But how do these games hold up today from a gameplay perspective? Well, this is a question that a lot of folks will most certainly be asking, especially when you first begin. We've become used to a lot of elements in modern games designed to facilitate easier progression. Things like waypoints, mini-maps, objective indicators, and more are all tools used in modern games to ensure that the player is never lost. It's true, you really can't get lost in a modern open-world game. So while it's true that Shenmue is of a much smaller scale than something like an Assassin's Creed title, it also highlights something that's kind of gone missing as of late: uncertainty in how to progress. Shenmue basically asks the player to figure out how to proceed through exploration and conversation. You do have a notebook to keep track of what you've uncovered, but that's basically it. You learn about the world and locate your objectives by observing and talking with others. Let's say you're searching for someone and learn about their location. Rather than pulling up a map and receiving a waypoint indicator, you might instead only receive the name of the place you're searching for, which in turn means that you'll be walking around the environment while searching for the location by reading signs and paying attention to clues. The world itself is your guide rather than some external thing like a map. It may seem like a minor thing, but it really helps draw you into the world. Now granted, this sort of gameplay can become difficult in a larger open world, but this sense of exploration is critical to Shenmue. The modern approach to navigation would absolutely spoil the experience, I believe. That's not to say everything's quite perfect. The controls, for instance, are a little awkward by today's standards. You use one of the triggers to run, and you control Yo using the analog stick or D-pad. At least using a modern controller, you have access to the camera while moving Yo around the environment, something that was kind of difficult on Dreamcast given that the analog stick and the D-pad are right on top of one another. So while it's slightly improved, it can still feel a little bit awkward in certain scenarios. So really, that's where we're at then. The conversion of Shenmue to modern platforms is fairly straightforward, but the development team has made all the right choices along the way. This is the full Shenmue experience, properly restored for a new generation. So with the first two games available once again, we're left waiting for Shenmue 3. Currently, the game is scheduled to release in 2019, which just happens to be exactly 20 years after the original Shenmue was released for Dreamcast in Japan. So hopefully the next time we discuss Shenmue on Digital Foundry, it will be while covering Shenmue 3. For now though, our look at the original two games is officially complete. Between the previous two DF Retro videos, which covered all the various intricacies of each version of the game in their original format, and now this video showcasing the new release, I think we've covered just about everything. But that's all for the moment. If you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like, subscribe, ring the notification bell up there, and follow us over on Twitter. And if you made it this far, thanks for joining me on all of our coverage of Shenmue. And if you haven't checked out the previous videos on the game over on DF Retro, be sure to give those a look as well. And until next time, stay cool.
Ine-san. Ine-san.
Funky rhythm,